In 865 AD, in a pit beneath York Fortress, the most famous Viking in the world is dying the most pathetic death imaginable. The air tastes of earth and venom. In the darkness, scales slide over stone with patient rustling. Creatures with all the time in the world. Above, King Aela's guards place bets on how long the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok will last. Not long. The serpents are efficient. Here's the bitter irony. The man who held Paris for ransom, who made kings pay him in silver just to leave, walked into this pit of his own free will. Not captured, not betrayed. But because his ego had grown so bloated, he believed he could conquer England with 2 ships. 2 ships against an entire kingdom. This isn't about a hero's glorious end. It's about a man so intoxicated by his own legend he forgot the first rule. Myths don't bleed, but men do. A king whose hunger for immortality made him raise sons greater than himself, only to discover that being surpassed by your own legacy is a death that happens while you're still breathing. How did the shrewdest warrior in the north become so drunk on his own divinity he believed the songs sung about him? How did a man who turned disadvantage into profit sail to his doom with a force that couldn't conquer a fishing village? To understand this fall, you need to understand the height, so let's leave him in the serpent's embrace and journey back, before the legend, when Ragnar was just a clever man with a ridiculous nickname and an appetite for other people's gold. While others sleep soundly, I dig through the archives for stories of spectacular self-destruction. So consider subscribing if you prefer your history without the hero worship, and drop a comment with where you're listening from. Misery loves geography. Now take a slow deep breath, close your eyes if you wish, and let me tell you how the mighty Ragnar became a meal for serpents. Before he was a legend, before the Scalds sang of his divine bloodline and his descent from Odin himself, Ragnar Lothbrok was just another ambitious young warrior with a problem and a solution that involved dead reptiles. The nickname itself tells you everything you need to know about the man he was before fame poisoned his judgment. Lothbrok. Hairy breeches. Not exactly the stuff of epic poetry, is it? The story goes that young Ragnar, eager to win the hand of his first wife Thora, had to defeat a serpent that guarded her bower. A massive creature that had started as a pet and grown into a monster. His solution was practical to the point of absurdity. He boiled a pair of woolen trousers in pitch and sand until they were stiff as armour. Protection against the beast's venomous blood. Picture it. The future terror of Europe. Stumbling through a Swedish forest in pants so rigid he could barely walk. Reeking of tar. Looking less like a legendary hero and more like a man who'd lost a bet. But here's the thing. It worked. He defeated the serpent, won the girl, and earned a nickname that would follow him to his grave. The hairy breeches themselves were ridiculous, but the mind that conceived them, that was sharp as a Saxon blade. This was Ragnar's genius in its purest form, the ability to see past the conventional solution to the one that actually worked. Other men might have relied on strength or courage or the favour of the gods. Ragnar relied on tar-soaked pants. It wasn't glorious. But glory wasn't the point. Winning was the point. The glory, he understood even then, could be added later by the Scalds. This pragmatism would define his greatest triumph. The siege of Paris in 845. The morning mist still clung to the Seine when Ragnar's fleet appeared like a nightmare made manifest. 120 ships, their dragon heads emerging from the fog like monsters from the deep. 5,000 warriors, their shields painted black, their intentions clear. Paris had seen Vikings before, but never like this, never in such numbers, never with such methodical intent. Charles the Bald, and yes, that was his actual name, though whether it referred to his scalp or his lack of backbone, history doesn't record, scrambled to mount a defence. The grandson of Charlemagne, ruler of the Western Frankish kingdom, commanded one of the most powerful armies in Christendom. On paper, He should have crushed this pagan upstart without breaking a sweat. But Ragnar didn't fight on paper. He fought in the real world, where psychology mattered more than numbers. The Frankish king made the fatal error of dividing his forces, placing troops on both banks of the Seine to protect the approaches to Paris. It was textbook strategy. Exactly what Ragnar had counted on. While Charles's advisors were no doubt congratulating themselves on their tactical brilliance, Ragnar did something unexpected. He ignored the larger force entirely and threw his entire fleet against the smaller contingent on one bank. The battle was swift and decisive. The isolated Frankish forces, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were overwhelmed in the morning sun. What followed was not an act of random battlefield chaos, but a calculated act of psychological warfare. Ragnar ordered a mass execution of prisoners on an island in the Seine, in full view of the remaining Frankish soldiers. The scene was orchestrated with the precision of a master performer. The executions took hours, each one calculated to break the will of those watching from the opposite bank. The message was clear. This is what awaits you. Not glory, not honour, just death while the ravens gather. By the time it was over, the Frankish army was already beginning to melt away. Soldiers remembered urgent business elsewhere. Nobles discovered pressing matters that required their immediate attention. Charles the Bald found himself commanding an army that existed more in theory than in fact. When Ragnar's forces reached Paris, they found a city that had defeated itself. The citizens had fled, taking anything of value they could carry. The great markets were empty, the churches stripped of their gold. Even worse, Ragnar's own men were beginning to sicken with dysentery, the invisible enemy that killed more Vikings than Frankish steel ever would. A lesser commander would have seen disaster, an empty city, a diseased army, and a wasted campaign. But Ragnar saw opportunity. He still had 5,000 armed men camped in the heart of the Frankish kingdom. That was leverage. That was currency. The negotiations were a masterpiece of extortion disguised as diplomacy. Ragnar didn't demand surrender. He didn't claim territory. He simply pointed out the obvious. He was here with an army, and Charles was not. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Charles would pay Ragnar to leave, not as tribute to a conqueror, but as a business transaction between reasonable men. 7,000 livres of gold and silver, 2,570 kilograms of precious metal, the first great Danegeld in Frankish history, though they didn't call it that yet. That name would come later, when paying Vikings to go away became as regular as the harvest. Charles paid. Of course he paid. What else could he do? His grandfather Charlemagne would have died of shame. But Charlemagne had never faced an enemy who treated warfare like a business model. Ragnar's ships rode low in the water on the journey home, weighted down with Frankish gold. His men sang victory songs, but Ragnar himself was already thinking ahead. This hadn't been a raid, it had been a proof of concept. Why conquer when you could extort? Why rule when you could simply threaten to arrive? But there was something else in his thoughts as he guided his fleet home through the autumn storms, something more personal than profit. Back in his hall, his young sons waited, Ivar and Bjorn, barely old enough to lift a sword, their eyes bright with hero worship whenever their father's name was mentioned. The gold wasn't just wealth, it was a future. It was the promise that his sons would never have to scramble for advantage the way he had. They would inherit not just silver, but reputation. They would start where he had climbed to. The feast that welcomed him home lasted for days. In the great hall, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the familiar smells of roasted meat and spilled mead, Ragnar played the role of the conquering hero, but in quieter moments, when the skalds rested their voices and the warriors dozed in their cups, he would watch his sons, Ivar, sharp as a blade despite his twisted legs, Bjorn, already showing the strength that would earn him his iron-sided nickname. He had given them the world, every lesson in strategy, every tale of victory, every piece of wisdom hard won through experience. All of it poured into eager young minds that absorbed it like dry earth drinks rain. The irony, beautiful and terrible, wouldn't become clear for years. Every lesson in victory he taught his sons was a lesson they would one day use to measure his own decline. Every strategy he shared was a weapon they would wield better than he ever could. He was teaching cubs to hunt, never imagining that one day he would look like prey. But that night, warmed by Frankish gold and surrounded by his legacy in making, Ragnar Lothbrok was just a father who had provided for his family, a clever man who had turned 2 ships and a sharp mind into enough wealth to secure his line for generations. The Serpent Slayer had become the serpent, coiled around his hoard, protective of his young, secure in his own cunning. He had no idea that the most dangerous venom was already in his veins, the slow poison of a reputation that would eventually demand more than any man could deliver. Success is a peculiar kind of curse. Each victory adds another link to the chains you don't realize you're forging until they're too heavy to bear. In the years following Paris, Ragnar's fame spread like a plague across the northern world. Every skald with a harp and a hunger for silver added new verses to the growing saga. The siege of Paris became not just a clever extortion, but a heroic conquest. The man who had worn tar-soaked pants to fight a snake became a descendant of Odin himself, blessed by the All-Father with divine wisdom and protected by the god's own favour. The tragedy is that Ragnar began to believe it. It started subtly, the way all poisonous transformations do. A casual acceptance when a skald compared him to the legendary heroes of old. A failure to correct the visiting jarls who spoke of his divine protection. A growing comfort with the hushed reverence that followed him through his own hall. The great feast hall at Uppsala, where Ragnar held court during the long winters, became a factory of myth-making. The skalds competed to craft the most elaborate praise poems, each trying to outdo the last in their descriptions of Ragnar's glory. He was no longer just a successful raider. He was the Serpent Slayer, the city taker, the one who made kings pay tribute. The cleverness that had saved him was transformed into divine wisdom. The pragmatism that had enriched him became the favour of the gods, and always, they sang of his lineage. How could such a man be merely mortal? Surely the blood of gods flowed in his veins. Surely he was descended from Odin himself, that wanderer between worlds, that father of victory. The warmth of the fire couldn't quite banish the shadows that gathered in the corners of the great hall. The smoke from the central hearth rose to the blackened rafters, carrying with it the smell of roasting meat and the weight of expectations that grew heavier with each passing season. Outside, the Swedish winter pressed against the walls like a living thing, but inside, the heat was oppressive. Too many bodies, too much mead, too many lies that sounded like truths. It was in this atmosphere that Ragnar's relationships became another battlefield, another stage for proving his legendary status. The stories of his first wife, the legendary shield maiden Lagertha, had been sanitized by the skalds into something almost romantic. The great hero winning the hand of the warrior woman through feats of strength. The truth, as usual, was less poetic and more revealing of the man Ragnar was becoming. He had heard of her first through tales of Swedish wars, this woman who fought with the fury of a berserker and the skill of a seasoned raider. The stories said she could defeat any warrior in single combat, that she had led charges that broke shield walls manned by veterans. Most men would have been intimidated. Ragnar was intrigued. When he finally tracked her to her farmstead, he found more than just a warrior. Lagertha had constructed her own small kingdom, independent and self-sufficient, defended by a massive trained bear and a hound bred for war. These weren't pets or guardians, they were a statement. Any man who wanted her would have to prove he was stronger than her defences, cleverer than her precautions, more determined than her will to remain free. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Ragnar overcame both beasts through a combination of strength and cunning. When he kicked down her door, still breathing hard from the fight, he found her waiting with her axe raised, ready to make him earn every step. What followed was less a courtship than a war of attrition. Every conversation was a battle, every domestic arrangement a negotiation of power. She tested him constantly, with her strength, her wit, her refusal to play the submissive wife, and he tested her in return, needing to prove again and again that he was the dominant force in their union. The marriage lasted 3 years, 3 years of passionate conflict, of a household where love and combat were often indistinguishable, of two people who could only express affection through competition. When he divorced her for Aslaug, it wasn't because he had stopped desiring her. It was because he had never truly conquered her. Even years later, that failure haunted him. When civil war threatened his kingdom and he needed military support, he had to go to her, not as a former husband claiming his rights, but as a supplicant begging for aid. She received him in her own hall, sitting in the high seat he had once occupied, wearing the crown she'd taken from her second husband after ending his reign. She agreed to help, but on her terms. She arrived with 120 ships, more than he had taken to Paris, and her forces turned the tide of battle. But the moment victory was secured, she left without a word, making it clear that she had come not for him but for her own reasons. The debt was his, the power was hers, and no amount of shared history could change that fundamental truth. Aslaug was different. Where Lagertha had been a test of strength, Aslaug was a test of wit, and by the time Ragnar met her, his need to test everyone around him had evolved from habit into compulsion. He found her during a raid in Norway, though found implies accident where there was only calculation. The local king had mentioned her in passing. A peasant girl of uncommon beauty and dangerous intelligence, living alone on a small farm. The combination was irresistible to a man who had begun to see every interaction as a contest. She called herself Kraka, and she was covered in the soot and grime of farm work. But her beauty was like a blade hidden in rough cloth, impossible to completely disguise. When he summoned her to his ship, he could have simply taken her. He had the men, the strength, the right of conquest. But that would have been too simple. Too much like admitting he was just another raider who took what he wanted by force. Instead, he set her a riddle, the kind of impossible challenge that gods threw at mortals in the old stories. Come to my ship neither dressed nor undressed, neither fed nor fasting, neither alone nor in company. It was designed to be unsolvable, to prove his intellectual superiority when she inevitably failed. She arrived the next morning wrapped in a fishing net, biting an onion, accompanied by a dog. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity, but what struck Ragnar most was her expression as she presented herself. There was no submission in her eyes, no acknowledgement of his cleverness in setting the test. Instead, there was a kind of pity, as if she was humouring a child who thought himself clever. She had solved his riddle not because she was impressed by it, but because it was the quickest way to get what she wanted. Marriage to a powerful warlord. It should have been a warning. A woman who could think that clearly, who could see through his games while playing along with them, was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with axes or shield walls. But Ragnar was entering the phase of his life where he mistook complexity for control, where he believed that by testing everyone, he was proving his superiority rather than revealing his insecurity. Only after their marriage did she reveal her true identity. Aslaug, daughter of the legendary dragon slayer Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhild. Her bloodline made his own carefully cultivated mythology look like the desperate invention it was. She had been royalty hiding in rags, while he was a commoner dressed in borrowed glory. The sons came quickly, each one a new complication in Ragnar's increasingly complex emotional landscape, and it was through his sons that the real cracks in his legend began to show. The night it truly began to turn was an autumn evening when the first snows dusted the mountains. The great hall was full of the usual crowd, warriors telling lies about their exploits, thralls scurrying between the tables, dogs fighting over scraps. The air was thick with smoke from the central fire and the competing smells of roasted meat, spilled mead, and too many unwashed bodies in an enclosed space. A new skald had arrived, young and eager, his harp freshly strung and his voice still clear. He took his place by the fire, waiting for the hall to quiet enough for his performance. When he began, his voice was pure and strong, weaving words together like a master craftsman working gold. But his chosen subject was not Ragnar's conquest of Paris. It was not the riddling of Aslaug or the taming of Lagertha. He sang of the sons of Ragnar. The hall fell into that particular kind of silence that precedes either violence or revelation. Warriors paused with their drinking horns halfway to their lips. Thralls forgot to refill the platters. Even the dogs, sensing the change in atmosphere, stopped their scavenging for scraps. Ragnar sat in his high seat, his face a carefully composed mask. The firelight played across his features, casting shadows that made his expression impossible to read. His hands rested on the carved arms of his chair, relaxed to any casual observer. But those who knew him well could see the telltale signs, the slight whitening of his knuckles, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly with each verse. The skald sang of Ivar, whose mind was sharper than any blade, who could win battles with words alone, of Bjorn, whose strength was becoming legendary, who had never met a foe he couldn't crush, of future kings whose deeds would echo through the ages, whose names would be remembered when their fathers was dust. Around the hall, men began to shift uncomfortably. They knew their lord, knew the dangerous ground the young skald was treading, but the boy sang on, oblivious to the tension, lost in the beauty of his own composition. Ragnar's face remained stone, but something flickered in his eyes, a complex storm of emotions that passed too quickly to fully catalogue. There was pride there, certainly. These were his sons being praised, his blood being elevated. Any father would feel his chest swell at such words, but there was something else, something darker that moved beneath the pride like a serpent beneath still water. It was there in the way his gaze lingered on the skald, in the slight tightening around his eyes, in the pause before his smile finally came. When the song ended, the hall held its breath. Ragnar rose from his seat, and for a moment, just a moment, his hand moved toward his sword, then it continued past. Reaching for the purse at his belt, he called the skald forward, his voice warm with what sounded like approval. He praised the boy's talent, the beauty of his words, the skill of his composition. Gold changed hands, more than was customary, enough to make the young man's eyes widen with delight. Then Ragnar raised his horn and called for a toast to his sons, to the next generation of heroes, to the glory that would outlive them all. He spoke of a father's joy at seeing his children surpass him, of the natural order of youth replacing age, of the pride that came from raising warriors who would reshape the world. The hall relaxed, horns were raised, the toast was drunk, the crisis had passed. Their lord had shown his magnanimity, his paternal pride, his acceptance of the natural order. But Aslaug, watching from her own seat, saw what others missed. She saw the way his hand trembled slightly as he raised his horn. She saw the muscle jumping in his jaw as he smiled. She saw the look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The look of a man who had just realized he was dying, not in body but in relevance. That night, after the hall had emptied and the fires burned low, she found him standing alone among the shadows. The great carved pillars that held up the roof seemed to press down on him, and in the flickering light, he looked older than his years. She approached carefully, the way one might approach a wounded bear. When she spoke, her voice was soft, careful not to shatter whatever fragile equilibrium he was maintaining. She reminded him that this was what he had wanted. Sons who would carry his name forward, who would build on what he had created. His response was a laugh that had no humour in it. He spoke of names and legacy, of songs and memory. Did she know, he asked, how many skalds still sang of his father? None. His father's name was already dust, remembered only as the man who sired Ragnar Lothbrok, and now, it seemed, Ragnar Lothbrok would be remembered only as the man who sired greater heroes. She tried to comfort him, to speak of the immortality that came from bloodlines, the glory of founding a dynasty. But he turned away, his eyes fixed on the dying embers of the fire. The sons he had raised to be great were becoming great. The lessons he had taught them were bearing fruit. Everything he had worked for was coming to pass, and it was killing him, as surely as any poison, as certainly as any blade. That night, after the hall had emptied and the fires burned low, Ragnar stood alone among the shadows. The great carved pillars that held up the roof seemed to lean inward, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt the weight of the structure pressing down on him. He was not yet old, not by the measure of warriors, but he felt the turning of years in a way that had nothing to do with his body. He had believed the songs, that was his great error. He had let the skalds convince him that he was touched by the gods, that his glory was divinely ordained and therefore eternal. But glory, he was beginning to understand, was not a possession to be hoarded. It was a flame that had to be fed, and it consumed everything. Pride, judgment, and eventually the man himself. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying the promise of a hard winter. Inside, Ragnar Lothbrok, descendant of Odin, or so the songs claimed, felt the first cold touch of a fear that no amount of mead could warm away. His sons would be greater than him. He had made sure of that, and it was killing him. Pride makes fools of us all, but it makes special fools of those who believe their own mythology. The transformation was gradual, the way a man's hair turns grey, unnoticeable day by day until one morning you look in the polished steel and see a stranger. Ragnar's pragmatism, that sharp tool that had served him so well, began to rust under the corrosive influence of his own legend. Where once he had calculated odds with the cold precision of a merchant, he now weighed them against the stories told about him. The great hall at Uppsala became less a seat of power and more a stage for increasingly desperate performances. Ragnar's plans grew grand where they had once been clever, reckless where they had once been calculated. He spoke of raids that would dwarf Paris, of kingdoms that would fall before him, of glory that would echo until Ragnarok itself. His old warriors, the men who had followed him up the Seine and seen him turn military disadvantage into profit, watched this transformation with growing unease. These were practical men who understood that victories were won by planning, not posturing. They had loved the clever Ragnar who wore tar-soaked pants to fight a serpent. They were less certain about this new Ragnar who seemed to think his divine bloodline made him invincible. The expeditions he led during this period were studies in escalating ambition, where once he might have struck at weak points, exploiting division and disorder, he now chose targets for their difficulty, for the glory their conquest would bring. It was as if he was trying to author his own saga, each chapter more improbable than the last. Some succeeded through sheer force and the loyalty of men who remembered the leader he had been. Others failed, though the skalds were always careful to frame these failures as strategic withdrawals or moral victories. The truth, known to those who had been there, was simpler. Ragnar was no longer fighting wars, he was fighting songs, and always, there were the reports of his sons. Ivar had taken a great fortress in Ireland through cunning alone, convincing the defenders to open their own gates. Bjorn was raiding in the Mediterranean. his ships reaching shores no Northman had seen before. Hvitzerk and Sigurd were carving out kingdoms in the east. Each report was a dagger, each success a wound that wouldn't heal. The Skalds, those carrion birds of reputation, sensed the shift in the wind. Their songs began to change, subtly at first. Where once Ragnar had been the subject, he became the context. Ragnar's sons was becoming a phrase more powerful than Ragnar alone. He was being transformed from a noun into an adjective, from a hero into a bloodline. It was in this state of mounting desperation that Ragnar conceived his final expedition, the one that would silence all doubts, overshadow all rivals, and restore his primacy in the songs of the North. He would conquer England with 2 ships. The announcement came at the spring feast, when the ice had broken on the fjords and the sailing season beckoned. The hall was full of warriors eager for raiding, their blood hot with winter's enforced idleness. Ragnar stood before them, still impressive despite the grey in his beard, and declared his intention. The silence that greeted his words was different from the respectful hush of earlier years. This was the silence of men trying to decide if they had heard correctly, if their lord had truly proposed something so monumentally foolish. 2 ships, perhaps 200 men, against the combined kingdoms of England. His wife Aslag was the first to break the silence. She had grown into her power over the years, the prophetic gifts of her Valkyrie mother manifesting more strongly as she aged. Standing in the great hall, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight, she spoke with the voice of one who had seen the threads of fate. Her warning was stark and unadorned. The expedition was doomed. His ships were insufficient. His timing poor. His motivations clouded. She had seen his death in her dreams. Not a glorious fall in battle, but something darker, more shameful. She begged him to reconsider, to wait, to gather a proper force. For a moment, the old Ragnar might have listened. The pragmatist who had turned disadvantage into profit might have recognized wisdom when it stood before him. But that Ragnar was buried beneath layers of myth and mounting desperation. He dismissed her prophecy with a gesture that was meant to be casual but came across as forced. What did the gods care for numbers? Had he not conquered Paris itself? Had he not built an empire from nothing? The blood of Odin flowed in his veins, or so the Skalds sang. 2 ships were all he needed because he was all he needed. Aslaug tried once more. From her own hands, she brought forth a shirt, woven with runes of protection, blessed with such power that no weapon could pierce it while he wore it. It was a last gift, a final attempt to save him from himself. He took it with thanks that didn't reach his eyes, already thinking past her to the glory that awaited. The preparations were made with the kind of grim efficiency that comes when men follow orders they don't believe in. 2 ships were readied. Good ships, but still only 2. Warriors were recruited, though many of his best men found reasons to be elsewhere. Those who joined him were the young seeking their first taste of glory, and the old who had nowhere else to go. Ragnar stood at the prow of his lead ship as they sailed from the harbour, his enchanted shirt beneath his mail, his face set toward England and immortality. Behind him, his homeland faded into mist. Those watching from the shore, his wife, his remaining warriors, perhaps even his gods, knew they were watching a dead man sail away. But Ragnar knew better. He was the serpent slayer, the city taker, the descendant of the All-Father himself. The Skalds would sing of this voyage for 1,000 years. How Ragnar the Magnificent conquered England with nothing but his will and 2 ships. It would be a feat to dwarf all others, a final proof that he was not merely the father of heroes but the greatest hero of all. The wind filled his sails, carrying him toward a destiny he had written for himself. He was no longer content to let fate weave his story. He would be author and hero both, writing his saga in English blood with a Danish blade. It never occurred to him that the stories we write for ourselves always end exactly as the gods intend. with our own words choking us. And so we return to the pit, where the serpents have been patient with their work. The great Ragnar Lothbrok, whose name once made kings reach for their treasuries rather than their swords, lies broken on English soil, not broken by battle. That would have been a death worth singing about, but broken by his own hubris, captured within hours of landing because even English farmers could count the difference between 2 ships and an invasion force. King Ella of Northumbria had been almost disappointed when they dragged Ragnar before him. This was the terror of Europe? This greying man with desperate eyes and delusions of divinity? The execution method was chosen more for poetry than cruelty. The serpent slayer would die by serpents. There was a satisfying symmetry to it that appealed to the Anglo-Saxon sense of narrative justice. They stripped him of his enchanted shirt, Aslau's last gift, which might have saved him if he'd had the humility to flee. But Ragnar Lothbrok did not flee. Even as they lowered him into the pit, he was composing his final verse, preparing his last performance. The snakes were efficient, but not quick. Venom works slowly when it enters through small punctures rather than veins. It gave him time, too much time, to reflect on the path that had led him here. The clever young warrior who had solved problems with tar-soaked pants. The pragmatic raider who had turned Paris's strength against itself. The father who had given his sons every advantage, never thinking they might use those advantages to surpass him, but even dying, even with poison coursing through his body. Ragnar found his moment of dark triumph. His last words were not a plea for mercy or a prayer to his gods. They were a prophecy and a threat, delivered with the same calculated precision he'd once used to negotiate ransoms. He spoke of little pigs and an old boar, of how his sons would grunt when they learned of his suffering. The words were crafted to spread, to reach across the sea to eager young ears that would hear in them not just a father's death, but a call to vengeance, and spread they did. The guards who heard them told others. The story grew in the telling, as all good stories do. By the time it reached the sons of Ragnar, it had become an epic of suffering, a tale that demanded blood for blood on a scale that would dwarf anything their father had achieved. The great heathen army that would descend on England, led by Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside, bringing more warriors than England had ever seen, would come not to conquer, but to avenge. They would tear through kingdoms like a blade through silk, all in the name of a father who had spent his last years trying to outshine them. The irony was exquisite. Ragnar had sailed to England to write a saga that would eclipse his sons. Instead, he gave them the greatest gift a father could offer, a reason to surpass every deed he'd ever done. His death became the foundational myth of their glory. The great heathen army would reshape England forever, and it would all be because Ragnar Lothbrok had given them the perfect story. As the venom finally reached his heart, as the darkness closed in from the edges of his vision, perhaps Ragnar understood at last. He had spent so many years trying to be the author of his own legend that he'd forgotten the first rule of stories. The best characters are the ones who don't survive to the end. He had wanted to be Odin, the All-Father, the eternal king of gods and men. But in the end, he was just what he had always been, the opening chapter in someone else's saga. His sons would be the heroes. He would be the reason they became heroes. His death would echo longer than his life. His failure would achieve more than his victories. The serpents finished their work as the sun set over Northumbria, casting long shadows across the land that would soon know the fury of Ragnar's sons. In the gathering darkness, the pit was just a hole in the ground, unmarked and unremarkable. No runestone would mark the spot where the great Viking died. No skald would sing of his final battle, because there hadn't been one, but they would sing of what came after. They would sing of the sons who turned all of England into their father's funeral pyre. They would sing of vengeance that reshaped the world, and always, in every version of the tale, Ragnar Lothbrok would be there, not as the hero, but as the ghost whose death drove heroes to greatness, He had craved immortality and found it in the cruelest way possible. He would live forever, but only as a prologue, the man who had worn hairy breeches to kill a serpent, who had turned military genius into profitable extortion, who had built a dynasty of warriors and kings. That man would be remembered primarily as the father who died so his sons could become legends. Rest now, in the quiet aftermath of ambition. Let the serpents and the darkness have their victory. Tomorrow, the world will burn in your name, and the flames will be tended by the sons you raised too well. You wanted a saga that would echo until the end of days. Be careful what you wish for. The gods, it seems, have a sense of humour as dark as the pit where legends go to die.